They called me Ops Ghost like I was some kind of urban legend haunting the back end. No name in meetings, no credit in quarterly updates, just a green status dot blinking beside Pulse Grid in the system's dashboard, as if that little pulse icon ran on corporate fairy dust and good intentions. Let me break it to you gently. Pulse Grid was me. Every real-time ops sync, every finance reconciliation, every client metric dashboard that magically loaded in under a second, that was my code, my logic, my system. But say that too loud and suddenly it's not a team player, right? I knew how forgotten I'd become the day I walked past the lunchroom and heard someone say, "Wait, is Linda still here?" Not sarcastic, just genuinely unaware. That's the level of erasure we're working with. Never mind that Pulse Grid basically duct-taped Advena Tech's broken bones together for 5 years straight. Never mind that when accounting had a panic attack mid-close last quarter, it was my undocumented rollback patch that saved the day. Never mind all that, because I didn't evangelize it with enough color-coded charts and pizza party pitches, I guess. Now don't get me wrong, I wasn't looking for some damn ticker tape parade. I like my quiet. I like my 3-monitor desk setup in the corner nobody wants because the air vent hisses like a demon with asthma. I like being able to hear my thoughts without Todd from sales hovering behind me asking how Wi-Fi works. I even liked our outdated coffee machine, bitter, ancient, and deeply disapproving, just like me. But what I didn't like, what I started to notice, was the way they'd smile too long when they said thanks for your help, and then CC someone 3 rungs above me when they actually push something live. Oh, and hey, since you've made it this far, do me a solid. Hit that little subscribe button and toss a like on this. It really motivates the team that helps me tell these stories, and honestly, they deserve the credit I never got. All right, back to the ghost story. So yes, I'd become invisible, but invisibility has perks. People forget you're in the room, they forget you have root access. They forget you wrote the code that writes the code. I'd be in those architecture strategy meetings where some shiny new hire from Stanford would wave their hands and say we needed a next-gen pipeline with dynamic cache logic, and I'd just sip my cold tea while Pulse Grid already did that silently, without drama, since 2019. Most of them thought Pulse Grid was open source. One guy, no joke, actually asked me if it was one of those pre-baked GitHub things. I told him yes because I didn't feel like explaining how I architected it over 4 Christmases, 2 hurricanes, and 1 gallbladder surgery. Leadership just saw it as this magical artifact. Like a vending machine, push the button, get the number. Nobody ever wonders who refills the snacks. That was me, the snack refiller of Advena Tech's digital bloodstream. My official title was Systems Optimization Lead, which is the kind of made-up nonsense HR cooks up when they can't justify your salary but don't want to lose you to a competitor. My unofficial title was, If Linda Quits, Everything Breaks. Not that they knew that, not yet. I was okay with being overlooked until I wasn't. Until the day I walked into the server room and found 3 strangers from vendor strategy standing over Pulse Grid's deployment logs like they'd discovered fire. Until the moment I saw that smug little smirk on the new COO's face. That's when I realized they weren't ignoring me anymore. They were circling, buzzing, like flies that think the meat's already dead. And meat doesn't usually bite back. But this time, oh honey, this time it had fangs. The first time I saw Chad Foster, he was wearing a shirt so tight it looked painted on, strutting through the hallway like he was auditioning for a reboot of Wall Street, the kind where Gordon Gekko sells Saw S instead of stocks. He had one of those Bluetooth earpieces jammed permanently in his ear like a cyborg birthmark, and he talked like a man who thought PowerPoint slides could solve world hunger. "Let's talk velocity," he said in his first all hands. "Let's disrupt from the inside out." He hadn't even figured out where the bathrooms were yet, and he was already throwing around words like synergy stack realignment and cloud-native agility. I watched from my usual back row seat, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug that said world's okayest engineer, and thought, here it comes. The cleanse, the whiteboard exorcism, the new broom that sweeps out anything that doesn't sparkle under a ring light. And sure enough, 2 days later I got a calendar invite from someone named Alexis in Tech Strategy Enablement, which is corporate for "We're here to gut the thing you built and call it innovation." The subject line said, Pulse Grid, Dependency Map and Ownership Clarification. Clarification, huh? I opened the invite and stared at it for a solid 30 seconds. My stomach didn't drop. My blood didn't boil. It was worse than that. I felt cold, like I'd just stepped into a freezer and realized I was the turkey. You don't ask for ownership clarification on something that's not about to be handed off, repackaged, or sold to some chucklehead vendor with a 3-slide pitch deck and a stolen Stack Overflow script. Still, I showed up, sat through their slideshow, listened to Alexis chirp about unified telemetry and upstream extensibility. They didn't even look at me while they spoke, like I was part of the carpet, like I was a time capsule they had to dust off before repurposing the land. Finally, Chad glanced at me briefly and said, Linda, if you could just outline all known dependencies and pain points for Pulse Grid, think of it like you're preparing for someone else to take the wheel. My mouth didn't move. I nodded, wrote it down, walked out. and started checking every single access log like my job depended on it because suddenly it did. Within a week, his little swarm had embedded itself. Consultants with expensive haircuts and matching MacBooks began drifting in and out of the Pulse Grid shell like bees in heat. I caught one of them, Ryan, I think, trying to run a schema diff without sandboxing it first. If I hadn't shadow flagged that attempt, the finance dashboard would have spit out numbers that looked like lottery picks. No one asked before poking around. No one notified me when they cloned the repo. They just assumed the system was plug and play, that they could unplug the brain and stick it into a prettier skull. I confronted Alexis after hours one day. She was microwaving cauliflower pizza in the break room and pretending to enjoy it. Hey, I said, calm and deliberate. Pulse Grid doesn't have documentation for a reason. I designed it to self-evolve based on conditional flag triggers. Anyone poking around needs admin clearance and context. Without it, she cut me off with a fake smile. Thanks, Linda. That's exactly why we're transitioning. We need systems that scale without being, tribal knowledge dependent. Tribal knowledge, that's what they called my life's work. As if I'd spent 5 years scratching code into the walls of a cave with a bone. That's when it clicked. They weren't just here to modernize, they were here to erase. Quietly, thoroughly. Strip the engine from the car and paint the shell neon green. The next morning, Slack permissions changed. I wasn't in the hash pulse grid core channel anymore. I wasn't in the sprint planning invite list. My access to Jenkins, limited, Git repo, view only. The system I built brick by digital brick was being barricaded from me. But here's the thing they didn't understand. I am the system. They can change all the locks they want. I forged the damn keys. They gave the town hall a stupid name, Momentum Unleashed. I remember that. Like we were all part of some overcaffeinated racehorse that needed to be let out of the gate by Chad Foster, our glorious COO, deliverer of agile synergy and other sacred nonsense. They made a whole event page for it. Sent out branded Zoom backgrounds, had a countdown timer, and hold music like we were tuning in for the Super Bowl instead of a glorified monologue about transformational org design. I logged in late on purpose. Video off. Mic muted, just a silent box named L. Monroe at the bottom of the participant list. By now, I'd been fully transitioned from Linda the quietly essential to Linda, the legacy attachment. They kept me around like a Christmas ornament no one wanted to hang, afraid I'd break if they touched me but too nervous to throw away. Chad, naturally, kicked off with a motivational quote misattributed to Einstein and a joke about how hard it is to uninstall old software, which I'm pretty sure was about people like me. The guy loved his metaphors. I'm surprised he didn't wheel out a whiteboard and draw a stick figure choking on outdated code. I only started paying attention when they switched to the slide labeled Next Gen Partnerships. That's when my ears perked up. Pulse Grid's modular transition will position us for scalable alignment with our external solution ecosystem, Chad said. I blinked. Modular transition. External ecosystem? He kept going, voice slick and rehearsed. We've already begun integrating with Velaventrix partners to ensure continuity while reducing tribal friction. There it was again, tribal, like I was a feral raccoon hoarding variables in a cave. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I almost typed something in the chat. Almost. And then it happened. He leaned sideways just a little and turned to one of the consultants sitting beside him. Could tell he thought he'd muted himself because his face relaxed, and that phony executive sparkle dropped just a hair. And then he said it. Honestly, he belongs in the basement with his little tool. He chuckled. The consultant did too. One of those awful, nasal little laughs like a balloon deflating through a straw. The pause that followed was unnatural. You could feel the entire company trying to process what they'd just heard. And then the chat exploded. Wait, did we all just hear that? Who's he? OMG, someone forgot to mute? I sat there, frozen, tea cooling in my hand, Slack lighting up like a Christmas tree. And all I could think about was that he, the guy with the little tool in the basement, was me. He didn't even know. That's what made it worse. He looked straight into the camera, not a flicker of realization on his smug little face. Never even considered that Linda might be the architect behind Pulse Grid. That I, woman, middle-aged, non-flashy, non-networky, could be the creator of the thing they were selling out from under me. He assumed I was a man. He assumed I was irrelevant. He assumed wrong. There was no apology, no follow-up email from HR. Just radio silence and a quiet shift in tone across the office. People avoided eye contact. The same ones who used to ping me after hours with quick fixes suddenly forgot I existed. I didn't respond, didn't demand an explanation, didn't ask for retraction. Instead, I took the rest of the day off, logged out, closed the laptop, sat in the dark of my living room with a glass of wine and an old notebook from Pulse Grid's early days where I'd mapped out the entire infrastructure on the back of a bar napkin during a snowstorm. And I decided, fine. If I'm the ghost in the basement with the little tool, then maybe it's time to let the house burn. It started with the test branch. Little blip in Git I wasn't supposed to see, buried under a label so vague it practically screamed guilt. Refactor V1 for external. Not a word to me about it. No tickets, no handoff request. No, hey Linda, mind walking us through the logic you wrote that's kept the company from descending into data hell for half a decade? Just code. My code. rearranged like furniture by someone who didn't know which pieces were load-bearing. They moved fast after the hot mic debacle. Too fast, like a magician waving one hand while the other picks your pocket. My Slack channels began vanishing one by one. First hash Pulse Grid Core, then hash Data Integrity, then even hash Coffee Club, which only had 3 members and mostly cat memes. My role was being scrubbed quietly. No formal demotion, no confrontation, just deletion. One permission toggle at a time. By Friday, my Jenkins access was revoked completely. I got a canned message from IT saying they were restructuring admin controls for security alignment. Security alignment, my ass? The only thing they were aligning was the noose. Still, I played dumb, nodded during meetings, took notes I didn't need, smiled politely while Chad walked around puffed up like a rooster in a startup hoodie. Kept referring to Pulse Grid as the backbone of our monetization pivot, like he'd written it himself in a fever dream after snorting lines of ChatGPT prompts. The moment that truly lit the fuse, though, was a Monday morning when I passed the West Conference Room and saw them, the new devs. They were all clustered around a TV screen displaying Pulse Grid's architecture map. My architecture map. I recognized the color coding. I recognized the annotation style. One of them even had a screenshot of a script I'd written and saved under the file name Lynn's Silent Logger v3, Pi, which was never meant to be shared. I stood there for a beat too long. One of the kids looked up, couldn't have been older than 24, probably thought YAML was a new brand of vape juice and actually waved at me, like I was a friendly ghost peeking in from another dimension. Morning, he chirped. I nodded and kept walking. Didn't say a word. That afternoon I started printing things. Not company secrets, nothing technically illegal, just logs, version histories, internal memos, old diagrams, emails with vague language about ownership reassessment and code migration strategy, anything that smelled like premeditated theft, and I backed up everything twice. One copy on a personal encrypted drive. The other, well, that one had a home they'd never find. Let's just say if you bury something deep enough in legal compliance systems, it becomes more secure than Fort Knox behind a firewall of boredom. That night, I went home and pulled out the old contract file I kept in my closet. The one from 3 years ago when they asked me to lead a vendor resiliency update and let me sneak in clauses no one bothered to read. One of them, buried under a subsection of a subsection, was labeled IP Reversion Protocol, Section 14.3b. It was dry, technical, dull enough that even legal had skimmed it. But if someone moved Pulse Grid externally without my written approval, if even one byte was transferred outside the bounds of our internal systems, the clause kicked in automatically. Access revoked. Audit logs preserved. Full rollback initiated. The clause was designed for doomsday, and wouldn't you know it, they just handed me the launch codes. Velaventrix was the name floating around now. Some strategic partner Chad had brought in from his old playground, promising to productize Pulse Grid. I'd seen their slide deck, buzzwords stacked like a game of Jenga, AI-driven predictive scalability, integrated user telemetry, client-flexible modularity. All of it built on the assumption they could crack open my system like a coconut and pour the juice into their own jar. The thing is, Pulse Grid wasn't built like normal software. It wasn't modular. It wasn't plug-and-play. It was a living, breathing, messy organism. There were dependencies nested inside dependencies, scripts that only triggered under obscure conditions, and logic webs even I had to diagram to remember. You don't just lift it out and hand it to a third-party vendor without consequence, unless you're arrogant or stupid or both. I started watching the logs more obsessively. Nightly commits, access IPs, endpoint pings. If they were going to walk into the lion's den, I was going to make sure they tripped every hidden wire on the way in. And I wouldn't make a sound. Not yet. It was 3 years ago. On a Thursday so forgettable, I only remember it because the cafeteria ran out of forks, and I had to eat a sad little microwave lasagna with a plastic knife. I was sitting in a freezing side office with a migraine, a broken radiator, and a compliance spreadsheet open so wide it looked like a crime scene. That was the day the seed got planted. The day I realized the only way to protect Pulse Grid was to hide a tripwire inside the very thing no one ever bothers to check, the paperwork. Back then, we were still a mid-sized tech firm pretending to be a startup, obsessed with disaster recovery. Cyber attacks, ransomware, alien invasions, our legal team wanted contingencies for everything but actual competence. They called it the Vendor Failover Protocol Initiative. Basically, if the building caught fire or someone spilled soup on the servers, we needed to know how to keep operations running. Naturally, they handed it to me. Linda, just plug your systems into the dock, said Ken from legal, spinning in his chair like a toddler on a sugar rush. Make it look airtight. We're presenting to the board next week. He didn't care how it worked, just needed it to look like it did. So I buried myself in jargon and insurance lingo, layered it with so much enterprise static that reading more than 3 lines without falling asleep required military training. But in the middle of it, I saw my chance. You see, I'd already been through a smaller betrayal a year before that. a failed acquisition that almost ripped Pulse Grid from our servers and handed it to a firm that thought MongoDB was a dessert. I remember staying up until 2 a.m. refactoring my code to untangle it from the APIs they tried to duct tape to it. No warning. No thanks. Just we'll take it from here, Linda. That night, I realized I'd built the entire system. They just signed the paychecks. So in that vendor failover doc under Section 9, asset reconciliation in the event of externalization, I added a tiny clause, just a few lines, buried under 5 subpoints and a whole paragraph about offsite backups. Clause Section 14.3b, IP Reversion Protocol. Legalese translation: if core system intellectual property, defined by access logs and usage metrics, is transferred, cloned, or exposed to any non-contracted external party without written sign-off from the original architect, me, the system automatically enters reversion mode. Access denied. Server-level lockdown. Audit logs frozen for review. Oh, and it would generate a little message, just one sentence. IP reversion executed. See clause section 14.3b. I wrapped it in so much compliance wrapping paper that not even our GC noticed. They were too busy asking if we had active shooter protocol language. I saved the document, uploaded it to our internal compliance vault, printed a copy and had Ken sign off with his usual chicken scratch initials. Then I let it sit, waiting, dormant, because I knew the day would come, not because I'm a pessimist, because I'm a realist, because sooner or later someone always walks into the server room with a golden ticket and thinks, I can take this. That clause, that was my hand on the detonator. Little insurance policy, in case some future Chad Foster swaggered in with glossy hair, and a 5-year plan to unlock new monetization potential by slicing my system open and selling the pieces to the highest bidder. And now, 3 years later, that exact thing was happening. Velaventrix was sniffing around, poking code they didn't understand, smiling for boardroom presentations like they were already cashing the checks. Only this time there was a clause. Only this time. The locks were rigged, and they hadn't read the fine print. The email wasn't even meant for me. That's what made it perfect. It leaked from a forwarded thread. Someone in marketing accidentally pasted it into a shared Google Doc and forgot to restrict permissions. I only saw it because I was helping format a launch deck on a lazy Friday afternoon, trying to keep my hands busy while my brain ticked like a time bomb. Subject line: Q3 Strategic Consolidation Pulse Grid Transition Plan. The message was short, self-congratulatory, and reeked of hubris. The kind of corporate backpatting that makes you want to slap someone with a whiteboard marker. Chad Foster's name was all over it. Finalizing the transition of Pulse Grid to Velaventrix partners for productization under Q3 roadmap. Anticipated rollout to client sandbox environments by July 15. Documentation and knowledge transfer in progress. Anticipate full integration by Q4. Knowledge transfer. Full integration. Client sandbox. I stared at the screen, my coffee forgotten, growing colder by the minute. They were actually doing it, pulling the pin, moving Pulse Grid out of the building without ever consulting me, notifying me, or asking for anything more than a glorified dependency list. I thought I'd just fade into the background like a deprecated package. They had no idea the box was wired. I didn't react, didn't forward it, didn't even screenshot it. I just sat there and read it 3 more times, each line settling like a weight behind my eyes. Then I closed the browser, opened my private documentation archive, and began my checklist. Because what they didn't understand, what they never understood, was that Pulse Grid wasn't just software, wasn't a product. It was an ecosystem held together by invisible ligaments, many of which ran through me. You don't just transition something like that. You don't uproot a tree that deep without snapping something vital. I checked the access logs again that night, Saturday, 2:37 a.m. A new IP had cloned the full system repo and pushed it into a secure third-party Git instance hosted by Velaventrix. The branch was labeled PG External Deploy. And just like that, Section 14.3b whispered to life. The protocol didn't trigger on access. It triggered on migration. And migration had just happened. One more step and the reversion clause would go live. They'd clicked the pen. They just hadn't signed the check yet. Monday morning came and went without a single email in my inbox. No invite to a transfer call. No documentation request. No mention of my name in any meeting summary or Slack thread. It was like I'd been erased entirely. Like Pulse Grid had sprung into existence from thin air and was now being handed over to a bunch of product guys with clean fingernails and zero clue what the hell they were holding. The transition continued in full theater mode. PowerPoint decks, glossy charts, LinkedIn updates with hashtags like #NextGenOps and #PulseForward. Chad strutted through the halls like he'd just invented post-it notes. I passed one of the Velaventrix suits in the elevator. He smiled, gave me that salesman nod like I was the janitor, and asked, "Hey, do you know where the server cage is?" I pointed without a word. Let him walk straight into his own grave. Behind the curtain, my system was quietly preparing for war. The moment external access triggered production-level authorization, the kill switch would activate. Log files would lock, dashboards would fail, authentication tokens would void. The only way back in would be through me, and they'd need a key I never gave them. By Wednesday, the company held a champagne toast in the break room. A literal toast. I watched from a distance as Chad clinked glasses with the Velaventrix team, delivering some pompous speech about unlocking scalability and modernizing our tech DNA. The interns smiled. The execs pretended to understand. Board reps stood there, nodding, counting invisible money. Not one of them noticed the blood-red indicator light blinking on the pulse grid dev terminal behind the glass. Reversion ready, true it was all going according to plan. They thought they were building momentum, but they were just walking deeper into the fuse. The office was quiet the day before the handoff. Too quiet. The kind of quiet you only get right before a storm or right after a crime. I sat at my desk, the same corner desk I'd occupied for 5 years, the one with the humming vent above and the view of the dumpster below, and watched the pulse grid status dashboard spin like nothing had changed. But everything had. I'd spent the night before pulling together the last pieces. First, the clause activation logs, time-stamped, cross-referenced, and signed with internal system certs that no one else even knew existed. Every IP access, every unauthorized push, every clone action outside the bounds of our internal infrastructure. I packaged them into a folder labeled Clause 14.3, B Activation Path Legal Reference Copy. Then I emailed a single sentence to my lawyer, confirming all conditions for reversion protocol have now been met. Archive package enclosed. He responded 5 minutes later with a thumbs-up emoji and the words "nice trap." I encrypted the archive twice, once under my standard 256-bit key, and again under the company's own compliance schema, just to be poetic about it. I burned it to a single, clean USB drive. No stickers, no label, just matte black plastic and quiet revenge. At 3:32 p.m., I walked down the beige hallway to the legal wing, same hallway I'd walked 100 times back when people still knew who I was. Back when Linda from Ops meant something other than an echo. I passed a junior associate who looked up at me and smiled nervously, like he'd seen a ghost. I nodded and placed the folder, USB inside, directly on the VP of Legal's desk. No appointment, no chit-chat. He was in a meeting anyway, probably drafting a press release about how Pulse Grid will elevate cross-industry solutions through collaborative partnerships. The cover page of the folder was plain, bold black font. Reversion Protocol, Section 14.3b beneath it. Authorization pending external activation. I didn't sign it, I didn't need to. My signature was already encoded in every trigger node inside the Pulse Grid system. The moment they ran a production-level data pull from Velaventrix's environment, the clause would go live. Access revoked. Server lockdown, audit freeze. And if everything timed just right, a single message would appear across every Pulse Grid terminal on launch morning. IP reversion executed. See clause section 14.3b. At 4 p.m. sharp, I submitted my PTO request through HR's archaic system. 1 week, effective immediately. No reason given. Just a note that said, out of office, please contact legal if urgent. I shut down my workstation, wiped the coffee ring off my desk with a napkin I'd saved from an old company party, and walked out without saying goodbye. The elevators were slow, like they knew. As I waited, I looked back down the hall, past the glass conference rooms, past the intern with the bubble tea, past the laminated motivational posters that promised innovation lives here. No one noticed me leave. That was the point. Because by the time they did notice me, by the time they realized Pulse Grid wasn't theirs to sell, repackage, or rebrand, I'd be 3 states away, drinking cheap wine with my feet in a river, watching the fuse burn. And it was burning. Quietly, beautifully, because the best kind of chaos isn't loud, it's precise. They called it launch day. There were balloons in the main lobby. Actual balloons. Some poor intern had been tasked with inflating them at 7 a.m. and tying them to a sign that read, Pulse Grid 2.0 powered by Velaventrix. I saw a photo later, posted to LinkedIn by one of the vendor reps, captioned, excited to activate next-gen infrastructure with the amazing Advena tech team. The timestamp on that post was 9:14 a.m. The reversion triggered at 9:17. It started with the server room. Velaventrix had flown in 2 of their senior integration engineers, identical twins in khakis and confidence, armed with fresh keycards and a checklist printed on glossy paper. They tried to badge into the secure ops floor like they owned the place. The lights above the reader turned red. Denied. They tried again. Denied. Then they noticed it. Taped to the glass door of the server room in clean Helvetica was a single white sheet of paper. IP reversion executed. See clause section 14.3b. No signature. No contact info. No instructions. Just that. One of them pulled out a phone and called someone. The other started pacing. A passing facilities guy asked if they needed help. They didn't answer. Someone took a picture of the letter and sent it to legal. Inside the building, dashboards began crashing. First, the client metrics went dark. Then finance. Then the operations command console, one that fed data into the nightly board reports, began looping a single error: pulse grid auth token invalid. Retry failed, reversion active. Slack lit up like a Christmas tree on fire. Panic messages flew across departments. Did anyone push an update? Is the system down? Why is everything redirecting to an error page? Who has access? Chad Foster was mid-call with investors when the news hit. He didn't mute his mic this time. Didn't need to. Everyone heard him slam the table. What the hell is a reversion protocol? I imagine someone whispered my name right about then. Maybe Alexis. Maybe one of the few engineers left who still remembered where Pulse Grid came from. But by the time legal found the folder on the VP's desk, the one I'd left with the USB drive and the clause, neatly printed and highlighted, they were already too late. The system had locked. The audit logs had frozen, and every access point outside the building was now flagged and firewalled under the terms they'd approved 3 years ago without reading a damn thing. Chad's calendar invite for the Pulse Grid global demo was still live. But the system, it was not. Finance tried to reroute through a backup module, but the dependencies were all hardwired. Legal tried to call Velaventrix, but their team was demanding answers of their own. What clause? Who's Linda? Do you mean the system isn't transferable? And meanwhile, across the country, in a quiet cabin 2 miles off a highway no one cared about, I sat on a screened-in porch with a second cup of coffee and a cheap Bluetooth speaker playing low jazz. My phone buzzed once, just once. An old coworker sent a screenshot. It was the Pulse Grid login page, but the color scheme was gone, just black and white now. And in the middle was the line I'd hard-coded to appear when the reversion was final: unauthorized external transition detected. IP ownership protected under Section 14.3b. Contact original architect for resolution. There was no contact link, no button, no path forward, just silence. And I smiled, not because I'd crippled them, not because their big demo was dead before it started. I smiled because they'd walked right into the trap, rating their ignorance like a banner, never once considering that the woman they dismissed, insulted, erased, might be the only one holding the keys. Pulse Grid was never theirs. And now they knew. The emergency board meeting was called for 8 a.m. sharp because when 7 departments crash in under 12 minutes and a multimillion-dollar demo dies on impact, people tend to panic in a synchronized fashion. They booked the big room. Glass walls. Polished wood. That one awkwardly placed ficus someone always knocks over. Chad was already seated when the board trickled in, sleeves rolled up, red-eyed, pacing between bottled water and self-destruction. Legal came in last. The VP carried a printed packet of papers in one hand, my folder in the other. You could see it before he even opened his mouth, he knew. He knew, and not just what happened, but who had made it happen. His eyes flicked to the door every 5 seconds like he was waiting for a ghost to arrive. He sat down, cleared his throat, and began reading aloud. Clause Section 14.3b, drafted and approved in 2020 under the Vendor Failover Protocol Initiative, states that all core operational IP, including but not limited to Pulse Grid and derivative systems, shall remain under the explicit control of the original architect, unless written sign-off is provided prior to external migration or duplication. He paused, looked around the table. No such sign-off was obtained. Migration logs confirm transfer to Velaventrix without authorization. The clause executed automatically. System locked, logs frozen. The boardroom fell silent except for the quiet creak of someone shifting in their leather chair. Wait, one of them said, blinking. Are you saying she still owns it? The VP nodded. Linda Monroe is the registered IP architect. She hard-coded the clause into the compliance protocol. She didn't approve the transfer. Another silence. Then a whisper just loud enough to carry. How the hell wasn't this caught? Chad looked like someone had poured boiling water down his spine. Red-faced, breathing too hard. He started mumbling about integration teams and assumption chains and legal oversights. Every word made him smaller. That's when the door opened. I didn't say anything, didn't smile. Just walked in calm as a snowfall. Set a matte black USB drive on the center of the table next to the untouched bowl of complimentary mints. Logs, I said, and proof. No one asked what kind, they knew. Chad finally looked up, and for the first time in his whole tenure at Advena Tech, he had nothing to say. Not a buzzword, not a single line of bluff or corporate poetry. Just a twitch in his jaw and a long, hard stare at the drive. One board member leaned forward. Linda, can this be undone? I looked at him calmly, not cruelly, and shook my head. The clause executed because the system was stolen, not migrated, not transitioned. Stolen, and that clause doesn't pause, it detonates. Murmurs erupted. Legal started flipping pages. Someone knocked over their coffee. I waited until the noise died down, then stepped forward, placing both hands on the table. You sold something. I said that was never yours to sell. And just like that, the room deflated. There was no slow clap, no triumphant music, just the weight of consequences settling into expensive suits. They didn't stand, didn't argue, didn't thank me. I turned and walked out. Pulse Grid wasn't theirs. It never had been. Now they remembered whose name was buried in its bones, and I didn't need a title or a desk or a padded LinkedIn headline to prove it. I had something better. Control. Appreciate you sticking around, you legends of the break room. Subscribe for more chaos. Let's make your old managers spill their coffee in fear.